I'm really happy to introduce Kevin Washburn, Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs of the United States Department of Interior. He's a member of the Chickasaw Nation in Oklahoma, sworn into office on October 9, 2012, and is responsible for carrying out the department's trust responsibility regarding the management of tribal and individual Indian trust lands and assets for promoting self-determination, economic self-sufficiency, and the nation's 566 federal recognized American Indian and Alaska Native tribes, and there are approximately 2 million enrolled members. Right now, help me welcome Mr. Kevin Washburn, Assistant Secretary.
Well, thank you for having me. We do have 566 tribes, and it's rare that I get to speak to 42 of them all at once, so it's a real honor to be here. As Victor said, I'm Chickasaw, not Chickaloon, Chickasaw. Those are my cousins over there at Chickaloon. But I feel really comfortable here. I walked in and there was a health fair going on, and my mom was a CHR, a community health representative for my tribe when I was growing up. And so, you know, we have a lot of differences in Indian country, but there's a lot of things we have in common too. And so I felt right at home when I saw that. So one of the things my mom taught me as a CHR, her job was really to help make sure people got the benefits that they needed to keep going. And she taught me to be a problem solver. And so we've been working real hard to do that in Washington. And I'm really happy to come out and talk to you about some of those problems that we're trying to solve. I see a lot of Victor. He has his butt in the airplane seat an awful lot so that he can come and give us guidance, and we really appreciate that. Before Victor, Jerry Isaac we saw a lot of him, and seen a lot of you. PJ out there and Brian Ridley over there comes to Washington quite a bit. How many of you in the audience have been to one of President Obama's White House Tribal Nations Conference before? Great. Well, I tell you, we're really proud of that. That's where we get a lot of our guidance. It's really important to have you all there and to inform us. Winston Churchill once said, "The United States always does the right thing after it has exhausted all other options." And I have to say, a lot of my job, I feel that way. It's like we're finally getting things fixed. But it's from you guys who travel out there and tell us what we need to be doing that helps to fix that. President Obama is working very, very hard for you. I'm mostly going to talk about land into trust today, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a couple of other things. Land is important. It's one of the most important things to tribes, and so I'm going to spend most of my time talking about land. But there are some other very, very important things to tribes too, and among the most important things to tribes is your children. And the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978, and I have to say it was a great law, but it has not lived up to its promise. We still seem to be losing far too many of our children. So that's one of the things we've been really taking up trying to improve. We've been working really hard to get state courts and state agencies to follow the Indian Child Welfare Act and follow it religiously and be faithful to its purposes. So we've done a lot of work in that area. We've recently put out some guidelines, and we're going to do some more things to try to make sure that courts, state courts and state agencies, state social workers, and adoption agencies especially, are living up to the Indian Child Welfare Act. So you're going to be seeing more from us on that, because children are our future, and as we saw those youth speaking here today, I was very proud of them too. I would have been mortified. I would have been terrified to be up here at the podium in front of a group this big, and so those kids are just absolutely terrific. You've got great leadership coming down in the future. Another thing that is important to tribes is promises. So I would be remiss also if I didn't say a little bit about contract support costs, because then under that Winston Churchill theory, this is one that we've kind of turned around finally as well. When we sign a contract with tribes or tribal consortia to help us meet our trust responsibility, we have to do what we say in those contracts. We have to pay full contract support costs. Otherwise, you don't have the money to do those services right. I know you don't have enough money anyway, probably, but you at least need to be getting what you're entitled to under the contract. So we appreciate the TCC and the tribes for taking on those contracts, and we need to be doing our part by paying full contract support costs. So we are paying full contract support costs. We've asked for full contract support cost funding, and we intend to make sure that we meet that. We're also trying to get mandatory funding for contract support costs, and that's sort of technical budget issues, so I won't go into great depth on that, but that's really important too. And I just noticed one of my former staffers, Christy Williams, in the back, but I get a lot of guidance from folks around here, and Christy's one of those who gives me that guidance, so I really appreciate that. So let me turn to land into trust, because I think that that's one of the things I really wanted to come here and talk to you about. We have changed our rule. Again, this is one of those things that was a long time coming. Alaska is the last frontier for 151 regs, for our land into trust regs, and we've broached that frontier though, and we now have a rule that says that we can take land into trust for Alaska tribes. Yeah, that's good news. Thank you. You know, we didn't get here quickly. We got here really slowly. I will tell you that we were kind of it was a long route to get here. When the IRA was passed, the Indian Reorganization Act, shortly after it was enacted, it was amended to ensure that tribes in Alaska could get land into trust. So there was a law in the books saying tribes in Alaska could have land into trust, but we really have only had land into trust for Metlakatla all this time. When ANCSA was enacted, people thought, well, that's a different route than land into trust, and so we shouldn't be taking land into trust for Alaska. And that was sort of the common thinking, and that was the common thinking for a long time. In fact, that was codified in our rules in 1980. And during the Clinton administration, they looked at this issue a little bit, but they ultimately kept the Alaska exception in there, said no land into trust for Alaska tribes. But they did say that it's not required by law. Solicitor John Leshy, back in about 2001, said, it's just a policy decision. It's not required by law, so it's something theoretically we could change. And then Heather Kendall Miller and others, plaintiffs, brought the Akiachak case against the department. About 2009, I think, is when it was filed, roughly. And they received a favorable decision in 2013. Now, that case was being litigated when I first arrived at the department, and I will tell you, it's hard to turn. You just saw the governor. It's hard to turn the ship of state. It doesn't. I mean, when you've got set positions, it's really hard to change those. So I feel for that guy standing at this podium, because I've tried to do it myself, and 97 days is not enough time to change all Alaska's policies regarding natives. I assure you of that. We'll be fortunate if he gets a lot of those policies changed in 4 years. Honestly, it's not easy to change a government. But the decision in the Akiachak it basically gave us another opportunity to look at this. The United States doesn't change its mind very often, and it doesn't change its mind just because one district court judge in one place comes out with the ruling. It usually takes a few circuits ruling against us before we finally change our mind, and often that doesn't even do the trick. It has to go all the way to the Supreme Court. But this case gave us an opportunity to change our mind, and in the spirit of Winston Churchill, we changed our mind, and we decided that we needed to really look at this. And so we gave it a lot of thought, and we did a lot of things. We listened to a lot of people. So there are 2 blue ribbon commissions that came out with reports. One of those was the Indian Law and Order Commission. In your agenda there's a picture of Troy Ide, who was chairman of the Indian Law and Order Commission. He came up here with his commission, and they looked at these issues, and they talked a lot about the problems with public safety. And one of the things that they suggest is there ought to be Indian country in Alaska. If there were Indian country in Alaska, tribes would have more authority to provide for public safety. The Commission on Indian Trust Reform also said that we should take land into trust. We should change our policy. And that was a secretarial commission, but it was 2 blue ribbon commissions that came out. So we put the question out there. We did a proposed rule. We asked people what they thought and asked for comments. And we got a lot of comments. And tribes were very favorable for land into trust. We got a lot of wonderful comments from tribes. We got strong comments from the Alaska Federation of Natives. AFN has been advocating for this for many, many years, and so they've weighed in. We also heard from regional corporations, the ANCs, and I will say none of the ANCs said we are opposed to land into trust for tribes. But they all did say they had concerns, and they have technical concerns and concerns about how the process might play out. But we heard from Sea-Alaska, and Sea-Alaska was actually favorable. They said, we've got some concerns, but we really do think tribes should have the ability to take land into trust. And we heard from Doyon and Arctic Slope and others as well. And they were, again, maybe a little less positive about it. But no one said don't do it. They said, we've got concerns about the process, and we need to make sure our concerns are met. Well, Alaska presents unique issues for land into trust. It presents unique issues for everything we do in Washington. And I will tell you, I've always had a little discomfort about the fact that, we have such a huge role in Washington, D.C. over what happens in Alaska, because frankly, you all ought to be making decisions about what happens in Alaska for most purposes. So that's one of the things, I'm a big self-governance guy, and if you believe in self-governance, you think that the communities here ought to be making decisions. So I think that there's a real benefit to land into trust, and then it can empower tribal communities to take care of public safety, can give them authority, can recognize their authority to take responsibility for public safety in your communities. We got the VAWA amendment, and we've now gotten the VAWA exception, the Alaska exception in VAWA corrected, but that's really a dead letter unless you have some land where you can exercise that authority, and so that's why we need land into trust. VAWA is great, but you got to have a place where you can exercise that authority. So ultimately, what we decided was, look, homelands are important to lower 48 tribes. They ought to be important. They must be important to Alaska tribes too. Everybody needs a home, and we decided that you deserve the opportunity also to seek land into trust. So now that's easy to say, and we fully believe that. But we know it's complicated up here, and we know the ANCs have an important role to play, an important voice, and so we don't want to ignore that. We think that that's important to listen to. So we think that when a tribe is considering land into trust, I wanted to talk to you really about some of the boring details, the technical details about land into trust. This is not all exciting stuff, but it's important. It's important for you all to have a sense of how it works. And not all lands should be taken into trust. That's true. It's some lands are appropriate to be taken into trust and some are not. One thing that happens when you take lands into trust, that land becomes subject to additional federal rules. And I will tell you, we've worked hard to streamline those rules. So one of the things, if we have land that's held in trust for a tribe, and the tribe wants to lease that land, you got to go through our leasing regulations. Now, we'd heard time in the past that it took 4, 5, 6 years sometimes just to lease a home on Indian lands. And so a couple of years ago, we took up our leasing regulations and we streamlined those. So now it doesn't take that much time. It takes more in the nature of 45 days. And if we don't get the application approved, then it automatically becomes approved by operation of law. So we've done a lot of things to streamline our regulations, so those regulations are not nearly so burdensome. And that's something the Obama administration wanted to do for the whole country. It was not because we were thinking about taking lands into trust in Alaska, but every tribe needs to be able to make quicker decisions about its land and be able to put it to use for economic development. We're doing the same thing with right-of-way regs, because if you want to get a right-of-way across federal land or federal trust land, you also have to go through our right-of-way regulations, but we're also streamlining those so that those will be easier to apply so they won't slow people down so much. And frankly, right-of-ways become a source of revenue for tribes, so that's something we've been very keen to fix, because tribes need to be leasing right-of-ways. It can be very useful as an economic development tool. Finally, in 2012, Congress enacted the Hearth Act, which gives tribes the authority to do the leasing approvals if they want to. If a tribe enacts legislation, its own ordinance or laws, it can run the leasing approval process on its reservation. And so we think that's a great idea. We've been encouraging tribes to do it. We've now got not quite 20 tribes that have enacted Hearth Act legislation, Hearth Act ordinances at the tribal level. So the BIA isn't doing the leasing on those lands or approving those leases. It's the tribe that's running that regulatory process. So that gives the tribes a lot more, self-governance and ability to move more quickly. So we have resolved a lot of these things. One of the things I hear a lot in Indian country is people have opinions about the way the BIA works, the way we do things. sometimes those opinions are based on information that is 20 years ago, and people don't credit the fact that we've actually changed. The organization has actually developed, and this stuff hasn't been in place for very long, so it's still happening. But we've dramatically improved the regulatory burdens that exist on trust lands because we know tribes need to be able to do economic development. Fact is, trust land can spur economic development. We have a lot of grant programs that are only eligible for trust lands. And you all can't apply for those because you don't have any trust lands. So if we have land in a trust for you, there will be some additional programs that you are eligible to apply for, and I'm talking about money, I'm talking about grants, that you can't apply for now. So once you have land in a trust, you may be eligible for those programs. Those, for example, are renewable energy development programs and stuff like that. So, but it's a bunch of things. It's housing and it's other things as well. So having trust land can spur economic development. It can bring more federal dollars to your communities. But economic development is crucial. I mean, public safety is, I think, our number one reason for doing this, but we also don't want people to lose sight of economic development because economic development ultimately contributes to public safety just as much as anything else does, because if people have jobs and they've got the money to solve problems, then we always see less crime. So we need to be attentive to the fact that the ANCs have concerns about this process and make sure that they've got a voice and that we're listening to their concerns too, because they also have constituencies that are very, very important, and we need to make sure those constituencies are served. Some tribal members are shareholders. Often it's the same constituency that we're trying to serve, and so their concerns and their questions are really relevant as we consider about how to take land into trust. One of the things we've heard from them is about subsurface mineral rights. I will tell you, we have lots of land in the lower 48 where one person owns the surface land, that's the tribe holding that property in trust, and someone else owns the mineral estate, and we don't have any problems. We are, those people that own the mineral estate, that's the dominant estate actually, and surface owners don't like it, but surface owners' interests are subservient to that mineral estate. So if someone's got a right to drill on your land or something like that, they get to do that. They have a right to do that, and they have to pay you a fair amount, a reasonable fee for that, but they are allowed to come onto your land, and they're allowed to come onto our land, onto our trust land that we hold in trust for tribes. So those are issues that we deal with all the time in the lower 48, and they don't seem to be that much of a problem. We manage to work okay despite those things. Now, people have accused me, I think a lot of people, if you talk to state and local governments, the people that don't like land into trust, you would think that I've got this big rubber stamp in my office that says approved on it, that every application that comes before us, I just stamp approved. I just give it a rubber stamp. But that's not true. It's a very elaborate process for taking land into trust, and I've got some of the steps in the process up here on these slides. Again, this is not interesting. It's very technical, but I just wanted to get people to understand. We have to have clear title to the land, and the tribe has to own that land in fee. We have to have a good land description, and as a lawyer, I will tell you, nearly every one of these comes in, and the land description often isn't quite right. We have to, and that's really technical legal work, getting the right legal description and title work done. So we have to clear any title defects in the land. We won't take it into trust unless it's pristine from a title standpoint. We also won't take it into trust unless it's pristine from an environmental point of view. And I know, honestly, that the federal government's responsible for some of the lands up here that have environmental problems. And even despite that, I'm here to tell you, we won't take that land back into trust unless those issues have been addressed. So we do site review on this inspection on the land. We do environmental compliance work involving NEPA. We have to evaluate the tribe's reason for taking the land into trust. Again, I'm all for tribal self-governance, but the law requires us to sort of look behind the tribe's decision and say, well, why do you need it in trust? Because you've now asked the federal government to do something to that land if you've applied to take it into trust. And so we have to evaluate the purpose and the business plan, if any, for taking that land into trust. So we also have to consider the views and often the objections, frankly, from state and local governments. And they don't get a veto, but they do get to state their piece. And they frankly, we get sued by them sometimes down the road for taking the action over their objections. And again, they don't get a veto, but we like to resolve those things if we can so that everybody's happy. There's sometimes other interested parties that will have something to say about it, neighbors and others. So we consider all those, and we certainly, the rules require us also to consider any potential jurisdictional conflicts. So it's an elaborate process. We have a lot of steps, a lot of things that we have to consider when we're thinking about taking land into trust for a tribe. And it's not a knee-jerk, it's not a rubber stamp type thing. We go through a lot of steps, and we think of a lot of different issues. Some of the considerations, these basically just went through these, but we have to look at all these different considerations before we take land into trust, and so we don't do it in a knee-jerk way. Now, having said that, we've taken a lot of land into trust in the lower 48. We've had 1,892 applications. I think that's last Friday's number. I was out of town, I was out of town on Friday. This might have been the previous Friday's number. I get this reported to me every Friday. How much more land did we get into trust this week? And so this number has been growing since Obama took office. The previous administration didn't take much land into trust. And so the Obama administration said, we think tribal homelands are important, so we're going to make this a real priority. And so President Obama said, we want to get this done. We want to take a lot of land into trust, restore tribal homelands. So since 2009, 1,892 applications. And each of those applications, an application might be for half an acre of land into trust. It might be for 5,000 acres for land into trust. But they each take the same amount of work. We have to go through all those steps that I just told you about before we can take that land into trust. So it's a heck of a lot of work. And an application may have one parcel in it, or it may have 12 parcels in it. It may have multiple parcels. So again, this is a really technical process, but it's ultimately, we've brought into trust more than 284,500 acres. I did the calculator a month back or something, and it was something like 350 square miles of land. You know, I've been telling people keep saying, when are you going to be done? When are you going to have enough? And I tend to tell people, when we get North America back, I'll be satisfied. Short of that, we're going to keep taking land into trust. So we do it for all sorts of reasons. Some of the reasons are, each of those parcels, each of them had a justification attached to it, a purpose. Agriculture, economic development, a few for gaming. Actually, gaming is the most controversial. We've only done 16 out of those numerous applications, only 16 for gaming, but a bunch for housing, a bunch for infrastructure, and then a bunch for multiple purposes or not clearly identified purposes. But we have taken a lot of land into trust for many different purposes. You all have different needs. Some of those might be wildlife refuges. It might be land that you want protected in some way. It might be a sacred site on that land too. I mean, these are sort of the economic development type purposes, but there are other important purposes for taking land into trust as well. So that's basically what I wanted to get across. I wanted all of you to understand how technical this is and how carefully we go through these things, because I will tell you there's a lot of people now that want to have land into trust, and they're going to be disappointed about how long it takes to get that done. But it's only because we have such a careful, deliberate process. We don't do anything with a rubber stamp. We are very careful about taking land into trust. We are very happy when we get it done because we think you need land in trust. We've made that decision that it's good for tribes to be able to have land in a trust. But that doesn't mean that we're going to be knee-jerk about it. We're going to think through every application very carefully. We've got a lot to learn up here about taking land into trust in Alaska, what the unique issues are, and we're trying to work through those. My regional director his flight was delayed, was out of Anchorage this morning, but I have we've been looking at some of the issues, and so that we've got a Q&A document that we'll try to get over here tomorrow to distribute. So that you've got, so you can see that we've been addressing some of these issues, looking into some of these issues, and I want to make sure you have those available. So, and as you and all, we were going to work through these issues together. That's the way the government's supposed to work. I won't say we have all the answers yet, We will, actual applications, real cases, actually have a way of bringing to light things you didn't think of before. That's the way all of life works, and so it'll work that way here too. So we will look forward to embracing those challenges as they come. Not every one of your land and trust applications is going to get approved. Some of them will be sent back to you, but it's something that we think overall it's an important policy decision, and we want you all to have the same access to homelands that tribes in the lower 48 have. So why don't I stop there and take some questions?
Okay, just letting everybody know, we're on time constraints. He has some other time meetings. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A, so please.
Yes, welcome to Alaska, Assistant Secretary Washburn. You'll find the interior Athabascan people and friendly, and not very often we get you to interior Alaska and hear our concerns and issues. Usually we go to Washington, D.C. One of the issues at the 500-foot level, because as a lawyer and you converse with other lawyers, we have lawyers also, but you guys are at the 50,000 feet level. At the 500 feet level, you know, at the village rural level, we're trying to get funding, and with land into trust, it might give us an opportunity to harness the federal impact aid program that comes to Alaska in the form of $133 million annually and is given to the state of Alaska. And it's reformulated and formulated again, and we don't hardly see any of that federal impact aid funding out in the rural areas to our schools, especially when we're fighting a $3.5 billion shortfall. Our kids' education is getting cut. So with that said, if we can find ways to benefit land into trust, is the federal impact aid program coming from D.C. Every dollar that leaves D.C. has got federal Indian preference on it. So kids living in the village, if we can get the land to where they live or where they go to school, because how the formula is now, it benefits the military. I have nothing against the military, but fair distribution among the rural areas, that's where we're feeling the pinch. Federal Indian kids who live on military lands, they get a big chunk of it. In the village schools, we don't have federal land, so if we can use that federal land, put it into trust, then our kids would be on federal land, and therefore we qualify for the federal impact aid program. So that's one avenue of how, in the 500-foot level, we can benefit from the federal impact aid program. In my closing comment, I'd like to encourage all other tribes in Alaska to look at the climate change adaptation plans and write your own. The city of Homer and Shaktoolik, only two in the state, and maybe you can elaborate, Assistant Secretary Washburn, on the amounts of money available for climate change adaptation plans. With that, I'd thank you, and please consider the federal impact aid program to benefit our rural schools for education. Thank you.
Thank you, PJ, and thanks for coming to Washington to advocate for Native Alaskans so often. Let me address both of those things. I'm not going to address impact aid alone, but let me just say this. One of the things that we have learned is there are a lot of programs, the federal pots of money, in essence, that only benefit states or local governments, and we keep finding them. We keep stumbling across them, basically. We keep looking to how are we going to solve this problem, and we find out about a pot of money like that. And so what we've been trying to do is every one of those, we've been trying to change them so that tribes can apply for those same funds. And so in the education area, early childhood education is one. And when we went to Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education, and said, the problem is only, he talks about early childhood education. We all know how important it is, but only state entities can apply for early childhood education money. So he agreed to change that. So now tribes have access to that same money. It's not even a set-aside, but they can apply for it in the same way. We've got a lot of things like that. I don't know if any of you heard the president at his State of the Union speech, but he offered he said one of our budget requests is free tuition for everybody for up to 2 years of community college. Well, We talked to them as they were formulating that, and that applies to tribal colleges as well. So we're trying to make sure that tribes have access to anything that anybody else would have access to as far as funding sources. And so I hear what you're saying. On CSC, PJ is absolutely right. You all are facing climate change issues more than anybody else. And you all are the poster child for resilient communities in the United States. I mean, no one has endured more than our Indian communities, and the ones in Alaska are facing real issues, and some of the ones in the lower 48 as well. So we've made about $10 million available in this past fiscal year and in the current fiscal year to support tribes to start to come up with plans to how to address climate change. And we've asked for about $40 million for climate change money in the 2016 budget because we need to be doing a heck of a lot more. We got to get ahead of this. This is really important. So I encourage all of you to do what PJ said, which is look for those grants, those RFPs, and start applying for that money, because we know you all need to be thinking about these issues, and we need to be helping develop your capacity so that you can address those. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Secretary Washburn.
Good morning. I also like to extend my thank you for attending our meeting here. This is the largest meeting that the Tanana Chiefs Conference have once a year, and it's very important to bring all the tribal people together with our tribes. But the thing I want to talk about is the land into trust. Our tribes are our governing bodies for our villages. They protect our sovereign rights as Indigenous people. And today, many of our corporation shareholders live in many areas of the world, and many of them have never been to our villages, and they really have no clue as to our way of life. They have no clue how we struggle to protect our land from trespassers and how to protect our waters. And I really believe that our future generation needs to have something protected for them. And that's why I support putting some of our land into trust, so that way it'll always be there for them, regardless of what happens with our corporations. We have compromised and compromised and compromised so much, and I think it's time for us to say we need to be firm in our decisions, and we need to make sure that Doyon, our corporation, my corporation, needs to protect our interest. And I think it's time that they sit down and talk with us as tribal leaders, as tribal people, because we are Doyon. And so I just really, want to say that I support land into trust. And I really hope that, our corporations will take the time to have a meeting like this and hash it out, because we have to have something for our grandchildren and our future children. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me say, that probably wasn't intended for me, to be quite fair. but let me just say this. I will tell you, I live in Washington, D.C. I live, I don't know how many thousands of miles away from here. It felt like a long time yesterday flying out here. I guess what I would say to you all is you've got bigger enemies than each other. There's a lot, bigger enemies out there. And so I do encourage you to talk. I think you need to get together and try to get on the same page, because ANCs are serving Indian people and tribes are serving Indian people, and we all need to work together, because we can serve them better if we cooperate than if we battle one another. And so I know that the ANCs have a duty to their shareholders, and that's what they're doing. They're fighting for their shareholders. Those shareholders tend to be Indian people, and so the work they're doing in Indian country is very important too. And I know that there's some tensions now and then, but we're all on the same side, to be quite honest. And we definitely have to. We don't. These disagreements should be sort of within the family, because this is kind of a family. And so I hope you all can get together and talk and work through those things. But we need to all be thinking about how can we serve Indian country better and create Indian country in this case. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to meet with the TCC delegates. But I basically have two questions, and that's piggybacking my colleagues on the e-board. And is there a time when you would be available to meet specifically with just the tribes in the region or state? I think it's always like today we're meeting because it's requested from TCC or Doyan or whatever. But specifically, we have a lot of other issues besides land into trust. Our tribe supports land into trust. But basically, there's a lot of other issues and needs under the Department of Interior. And the land into trust would you support additional technical assistance for the tribe to implement that? Or would there be additional funding for it? Those are two basic questions.
Well, let me say yes. Yeah, every day of my life I meet with tribes. That's what I do. That's my job. And this is a really, really short trip, so I haven't had a whole lot of time to schedule side meetings. And I didn't bring any staff with me either. I traveled all alone. I don't like to, it was a Sunday, and I didn't want to, bring an entourage, make a whole bunch of people be away from their families. Yes, I'm always willing to meet with tribes, whether it's one-on-one or in groups or whatever. And I usually do that when I'm out in the state. And I certainly meet with a lot of Alaskans when they come to Washington, D.C. And thank you for coming, because that's always helpful. It always educates me. The second question related to land into trust. I lost it.
The question was that, do you support additional funding for implementation?
Well, I support the president's budget, and the president has asked for $323 million additionally in our budget. My Indian Affairs budget is about $2.6 billion for the whole country, and he's asked for more than $2.9 billion for this coming year. And we know that if we take land into trust, it imposes bigger burdens on us. Among those being that we got to manage that land now. That's land that's now our responsibility. And so we know that we need to live up to that responsibility. Whenever we take land into trust, the tribe has greater authority and we have more responsibility. And so we know that we have to manage that land well. And we fully intend to do that. So as we go forward, in the grand scheme of things, we've lost hundreds of millions of acres. And so, while we're really proud of that number, 284,000 acres, it's a tiny little drop in the bucket when you think of all the land that we lost. And so it hasn't, at this point, been exceedingly difficult to, those additional management responsibilities haven't been actually that great yet. But we know that could happen, and we intend to do our job there. Thank you.
Good morning, Secretary Washburn. My name is Curtis Summer from the native village of Tanana. I had a comment to make on your land into trust. Some years ago at an NCAI conference, it was reported that Department of Interior employees were deliberately destroying documents in relation to land into trust, and knowing that natives had settled for $2.7 billion. Actually, the number should be closer to $150 to $200 billion worth of leases that were stolen from the natives. And, it's stuff like that we deal with, and the contract support costs, the IHS and BIA funding, the tribal transportation funding, all come from discretionary sources of funding. Whatever Congress think that the natives are worth, and that's what they give the natives. Our health care ranks lower than federal prisoners' health care in the grand scheme of things. We have resolution here from Tanana to make all these sources of funding come from discretionary funding, or mandatory funding, knowing that we rank lower than other countries, that the U.S. sends money to $6 trillion for Iraq and Afghanistan before you count ISIS or Taliban resurgence and stuff. That works against us. But I want to thank you, and I think We should make it so that people like you who deal with natives all have the same basic knowledge of natives here in America. That's why I think it's so important to have a mandatory native history curriculum in our school system so that the U.S. Supreme Court justices, the legislators, all three branches in the federal government will have a basic knowledge of natives and how to deal with natives as we all have to deal with the government, you know. But I want to thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, and you will get an amen on that last point for sure. So, thank you. Last question, and I got to run off to the airport, but please.
Yes, I'm Elizabeth Woods. I'm from Manly. I'm a delegate. I had some questions, but one was the revenue off the land. Would that be given to the BIA and then out to the tribes or into the federal government? And the other one was these grants you talk about. A lot of these grants are for low income. And Manly doesn't really qualify as low income. Our housing, even our youth. Our youth cannot get, we can't use this grants for our youth because they're not low income. Mm-hmm. And to me, being low income is just like a burden. You know, we're trying to get out of that status. And this is Indian dollars. And if you're not low income, you don't qualify. So I wish that we can kind of take care of that status where we can all benefit. So that's my...
Well, thank you. You raised a really good question. Yeah. You raised a really good question that I didn't take up in my talk, but let me address that because it's important. So taxation. So when we earn revenues from a lease on Indian lands, for example, or from exploiting that land in some way, those revenues that we earn, they do go to the federal government, but they go in trust for whoever owned the land, whoever we were holding the land in trust for. That's trust income on that land, and it belongs to that community, that tribe. And the beauty of that, too, it's trust income, so it's not subject to taxation when it's distributed. It's not subject to federal taxation. So it's a way to do economic development that is not subject to taxes, which is really a plus for trust land. That's another reason we really like having land in a trust, because if we have timber on that land or we have some activity on that land that's bringing us money, when that money gets distributed, it's not subject to taxation. There's an exception to that for gaming, but for all other things, those are trust resources and trust income, and you don't have to pay taxes when it gets distributed to the tribe or the tribe distributes it to its members. So thank you. Listen, I want to thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here with all of you, I really am. I rarely get this honor. I don't get it nearly enough. I don't do a lot of traveling. I try to stick to my knitting because there's a lot of stuff that needs to get back done in Washington. But it's a real honor to be here, and I really thank you for welcoming me here. Thank you.